Nick, you were saying that you were born in the United States and spent some childhood there, I guess, before moving back to Canada. And I'm kind of curious if you would like to talk a little bit about those early experiences and to what extent you found yourself moving towards becoming the artist that you are now. So what early experiences or circumstances do you think might have elicited that direction in you?
Well, certainly there was what I was, I think, innately drawn to as a child, as an activity, solitary creative pursuits, especially drawing, so a type of intuitive engagement with mark making on its most basic level, and just generating a lot of material, which of course my parents kept and were quite proud of, and were quite taken, or quite they certainly made note of my career urges, and I think perhaps outside of that, a fascination with visual aspects of the world, sense impressions, effects of light and shadow, effects of architecture, landscape, quotidian surroundings, which has really stayed with me as an abiding concern, as an artist, as a painter.
So, the support that you received, well, obviously some parental support, but also I imagine through high school, and I guess you ultimately pursued that further.
Yes, the encouragement certainly in high school, simply reflected in my grades, in terms of how well I did in visual art and in English literature. Upon graduating, I thought, I had some other notions in mind that were still maybe related to creative activity, but I thought of architecture, for example. My father was an architect. I thought of writing in some capacity. So there are a number of notions, but I was really taken with the idea of going to OCA and pursuing painting in particular, drawing and painting.
At that point, once you're at OCA, you're obviously on a route to become a professional artist. And so I'm kind of curious about this question of what an artist does.
Okay.
And I'd be interested to know if you found some sense about that when you're studying at the art college, or whether you've developed a sense of what an artist does subsequently.
I think both. I think that certainly there was an awakening to a degree of maybe not so much what an artist does, because I think that my conception of what a painter might do, the physical activity I don't think has altered much, but I think the discourse certainly shifted profoundly. I mean, at first, upon going to OCA, and I guess prior to going to OCA, I mean in high school, and my exposure to contemporary art, my exposure such as it was, which was really based on looking at a few art magazines and a few monographs, was rooted in a early 20th century notion. And so there was a huge gap or void in terms of my awareness of art making from the 60s forward to the 90s when I was going to OCA. And so, you know, the whole shift away from, well, from medium specificity for one, but also from a model of making that was rooted in say, self-expression or emotion. I mean, that notion is what I had in mind prior to going to OCA. So becoming aware of the discourse and certain aspects of theory that informed contemporary art making, you know, and the shift away from, I think, a notion of self-expression to a notion of framing aspects of culture and the world in a more nuanced manner. And then, of course, after OCA, I think, you know, my conception of art making shifted further as I read more and as I made more work. Perhaps it moved further away from an expressionistic model to a model that was more about a discourse or participating in a broader cultural discourse, and thinking that I maybe didn't need to put as much of myself into my work, but I could put more of the world into my work, or an attempt to do that, I think was something that I gradually realized.
I'd be interested to know if you can articulate what you might consider the core idea that underlines the work or frames it, Nick, but I have noticed that there has been some discussion about your work, and one point that has been raised is that the work has explored a series of dialectical relationships between light and shadow, presence and absence, proximity and distance, and more specifically between the notions of domestic space and the aesthetics of minimalist abstraction. That's a quote. I'm curious if that quote seems adequate to you, or if you'd like to explore it further in terms of how you understand the core concepts that frame your practice.
I think for the work of the past few years, that statement encapsulates my present concerns. I think to pull back and assess my work more broadly, I think it's about ways of framing or ways of approaching or articulating our experience of everyday space and the phenomena within everyday space and the temporal component within that. So looking at aspects of space through memory, through forms of temporal distance, and then through spatialization in terms of, you know, the reproductive or the representational mechanics of photography and how that then can be recontextualized through a painting. So these layers, these ways of shifting or reframing our experience of our everyday surroundings has been, I think, the thematic conceptual guide ever since I graduated from OCA now. So it's I mean, formally I think it's taken different guises, and I've referred to other imaging technologies. For example, cinema was an analogy that I used with a lot of my earlier work. And recently I've started thinking about that again, and I've started to reconsider ways to situate my work within that type of context. But I'd say that experience of, a very simple experience of space, and the fact that with painting, painting for me is very polyvalent, where it's always functioning on just double register, and so it's often this very simple phenomenon of material pigment on a flat surface, which can signify or elicit an experience of other spaces and other temporalities, and how that seems to maybe be taken for granted now. This type of ambiguity, which I think for me is, it's a very rich and very a very consequential effect that the medium has for me, and I think that is probably why I've continued to paint, as opposed to branch out into other disciplines and mediums.
There's a painting called Soccer Field that you did a few years ago.
Right.
Which to me is somewhat emblematic of your earlier practice, perhaps. And then there's a work like Corner, I think we could quote, or the series Some New Paintings, it's more recent. So there's a shift here between, at least in the way in which you imagine representation.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, I think that the early work that probably spans from about 1999 to 2006 or 7 was quite closely aligned with the photographic referent that was really a guide, thematic and compositional guide for the work. And I, at the time, after I'd worked with that approach for a number of years, I felt a degree of restlessness. I felt a degree of constraint, perhaps, that I wanted to break away from, that I wanted to try and explore the medium onto itself without that overt representational aspect to it, or construct. And so I shifted into perhaps a more impressionistic exploration of space that was still informed by photography, but I was interested in allowing the process of painting to guide the work, and so that shifted the way I worked too. It was less immediate. It was more about layering, about potentially effacing an initial painting to arrive at something else, and so it was really a sort of a venture into a space of painting that was quite established historically. I mean, within modernist painting, but for me, felt utterly strange. So when I see this now, I see that I was, in art historical terms, in a way working backwards to arrive at, a type of, a conception of painting that had been maybe established at the beginning of the 20th century.
When I interpret what you're saying, in order to look at the paintings that are actually in the studio behind you, the painting in the middle of these three paintings that we're looking at very clearly has a representational feel about it, basket,
Yes.
close up or something. The other paintings would seem to riff off that, but in a direction that takes it much further away from the very clear presentation of the representational. Is it that shift from the one to the other that, putting words in your mouth, but was scarily exciting for you, or?
It was, and these works I arrived at essentially through, I don't know if it's an accident or an urge to simply deface an earlier painting. Wanting to kind of void an initial painting through the use of hot paint, realizing that I could achieve these translucent layers that, for me, align it, that bring it back to the photographic, but in a way much different from my earlier work. So it's sort of, it's a way of distancing the work for me from its first iteration or incarnation, and a way to play with both the surface of the pigment on the canvas and to achieve an initial, not initial, but a further degree of illusionistic depth, or a type of spatial distance, so that it's pushed further away from the physical surface into a less fixed register or surface.
What's the title?
So all of these are, they're simply called baskets, and they're numbered, and they're the second series of work I've made. These are all from about a year ago, 2015. I made a previous series in 2014. And the other key shift for me with these works, or starting with the previous series, was this idea of seriality and repetition. Repetition and difference, essentially. And prior to these works, I was really working, I was making paintings in series that fit together thematically, but they were singular works. So each painting depicted a single motif that maybe were connected through a broader thematic. But to explore, I suppose, the infra-thin, or these very slight and subtle nuances from one painting to the next, was something, again, that was wholly new to me, and something that I wanted to explore. And this motif felt conducive to that experimentation or investigation.
As I look at them, the two especially here, I'm struck by the fact that from one perspective, one could see it as the same image, basket, lights on, lights off. So I walked into a dark room, I've got the basket on the right. I walked into a well-lit room, I have one in the middle. Does light play a significant factor in your understanding of the shift from one kind of representation to another?
I think it's perhaps a determining factor in that regard. And I mean, these works are anecdotal insofar as they connect to my family, to familial history. This basket I actually encountered initially in a dark basement, and I did not consciously set out to depict the crepuscular conditions in which I first encountered it. But perhaps that was an informing factor in why I chose to continue working with this blackened glazing effect. Certainly, what's revealed under bright light or standard light versus what is concealed, but also what allows for more projection on the part of the viewer when details are omitted and when the image becomes murky or faint, is something that I've been constantly fascinated with. That again, that perceptual shift from, and perhaps it's just a way to trigger, to remove a degree of certainty about what we think we see versus maybe what we're actually seeing or what's actually there. Is something, again, that has functioned in different ways throughout the work I've made.
I could ask you about the processes involved in a very practical kind of way. Nick, when you're working on a painting, I don't know, is there something you would like to mention about the actual process of painting itself?
I think in many ways it's a fairly traditional or straightforward practice. Often I draw out the composition. Well, actually, I should start with the initial conception, which is often rooted in photography, as I've mentioned. So generating photographic references to work from. So in these cases, they were all images that I took. And what I did with these works was I had the basket and I photographed them. I took photographs of 15 perspectives, basically circling around the object. And so each one is connected to a photograph depicting one perspective. And so everything is fairly predetermined. I'm not necessarily playing with the composition, but it's already mapped out for me. And then the idea with these was to actually install them so that they in turn circle the viewer, so inverting the idea of circling an object and having these objects now circle us. And so working from the photograph, selecting a photograph, drawing out the composition, and then making the painting. So it was a real systemized way of working that again was new for me, because prior to this I had a fairly defined methodological approach, which again was rooted in taking an image, making studies of it, exploring it often with works on paper or drawing, and then making a painting or making a series of paintings, sometimes exploring different sizes, different shifts in hue and color. So fairly straightforward painterly concerns. And there was always a degree of anxiety, and there's always still is a degree of anxiety, wondering how the work will turn out. I think that's what sustains my interest too, is that degree of doubt that's ever present. These function much differently, these works, because I knew exactly what would happen, and it was more about being very mechanical with their creation. It's not creation, it's more execution. I think the creation happened at the very beginning, and it was a sort of a systematized mechanical mode of production.
In this relationship between the material of paint, the material of painting, the materials of painting, and the idea that you bring to it, I think you expressed it a little bit ago, the notion of doubt.
Right, right.
Particularly, I suppose, in the act of execution.
Right.
So, doubt is a very important factor for you.
Yeah, doubt is, it's something that I think is built into the idea of being a painter, perhaps, for me. I mean, doubt in terms of the execution of the work, but perhaps doubt too in terms of how paintings function in the world now, what it means to be a painter, what ontologically painting in the 21st century. But I mean, on a practical level, it's never feeling I can fully control what happens, say, when I drag the brush or in this case, a towel to create this thin veiled technique. It never does exactly what I want, and I think that if I could get it to do exactly what I wanted, I'd probably just stop doing it. So it's that potential for resistance or for failure that I think that sustains me. So a degree of control that I can never fully, a desire for control that will not be controlled completely. I think is why I haven't shifted into, say, photography, which at times has felt like it would be the natural shift for me with my concerns, or perhaps film. And in some ways, perhaps film would be a more logical shift than photography, given the aspects of temporality that I'm fascinated with painting.
The question of painting is a perennial one.
Yes.
Maybe that's one of the most interesting things about painting. But it leads me to a question about how do you feel about painting in the 21st century, at least this part of it. And maybe my question centers on what do you understand to be the discourse that seems to bind contemporary art together, or if there is one, and how painting kind of sneaks into it and pushes it or does something to it. What is the relationship between painting and what one might call the zeitgeist of the moment?
Yeah, it's a question that I think about a lot, that I struggle with, I grapple with, especially for me now, having been a practicing artist for about just over 15 years. When I went to OCA in the 90s, if there was a zeitgeist then, it seemed, and maybe it's because I just recently reread this essay, The Allegorical Impulse, Craig Owens. Thinking about how so much work then, both within painting and outside of painting, did function as a type of allegory. How mere formal concerns were considered by many to be insufficient for how a work should operate. And I think the discourse around painting then was that painting still had to validate itself as being sufficient to partake in a broader conversation. And I think that a degree of theory was still inflecting the conversation much more than it is now. And so seeing the shift both within painting and within broader global contemporary art practice, I don't know if there is one zeitgeist now. I think that on the one hand there's a shift within, say, installation art towards these grand spectacular gestures that one might see at biennials or art fairs. And then I think there's a counter shift perhaps within painting to resist that, to try and fight against the spectacle, perhaps with a return to very intimate handmade practices that really attempt to embrace the sort of the retardation of time that is innate within painting. Certainly, I see painting more and more as a type of resistance towards not just other forms of art making, but the velocity, the hypervelocity, the acceleration of time that really is dominant within our life now. And I don't know if this is connected with an urge towards abstraction within painting on the part of so many painters, but that's certainly another shift from when I was a student at OCA to now is, and not just abstraction, but I think a celebration of a type of modernist aesthetic that I guess I'm conflicted about. So it's a curious situation for me now to see, to be teaching younger artists, to be teaching students who are formulating concerns that are really different from what my concerns were. I mean, just based on the radical shift in the contemporary art scene. Yeah, getting back to the question of zeitgeist, even in Toronto, it seems as though there are so many different, micro scenes or micro tendencies perhaps based on age or generation, but also based on medium and the concerns that are connected to particular mediums.
Resistance and confliction. Do you think perhaps that the speed of the culture that we have now, the technological turnover, if it's partly that, requires these factors, confliction and resistance? Do you think painting actually has found a moment, you might say a moment of truth, at precisely that point at which the zeitgeist would seem to be furthest away from it?
Yes, I think so. Or I would like to think so. I would like to think that for the way I work, for my own concerns. But based on conversations I've had with other painters, other artists that work with painting, there does seem to be some unanimous sense that there is a reprieve, or there is some type of respite from this onrush of stimuli. Painting offers a different degree of temporal experience. I mean, for me, it really is a temporal unfolding, the way I make the work, but then also ideally the way it would be experienced is, and I think that's why cinema is such a suitable analogy, because there's a similar type of unfolding, whether it's a narrative or whether it's just a broader perception of what a single painting might be doing. Now, whether many viewers grant it that sufficient degree of time is another question. But I mean, some do, and that's always the hope that the viewer will.
And I was looking at these paintings and thinking that Heidegger's concept of the unconcealing can, in a sense, work in both directions. The black painting essentially unconceals the truth that lies behind the representational painting in the middle.
Right.
But on the other hand, the representational painting in the middle unconceals the truth that lies hidden within the obscurity of the black painting. So I was kind of curious about the doubling of the Heideggerian notion of unconcealment.
That's really interesting. Yeah, I mean, and perhaps, one could think of a perceptual unconcealing versus a conceptual or
Yeah, yeah.
intellectual. And
It's a portable concept. You can apply it in a number of
Yeah.
different ways. Anyway, well, speaking of Heidegger, Nick, not just because you teach, and we'll get back to that, but because theory has played such a role in art making, really, art practices, over the last several decades. And we know all about that. So my question really is, to what extent has theory played a role in your thinking about your practice?
I think I think I've absorbed a sensibility, perhaps, or I've formed a sensibility that's been inspired by certain theoretical principles. For example, a rejection of essentializing impulses, a belief in generating meaning through contingency and contextualization, adjacency, ambiguity, skepticism towards authorial gestures, and so it's I don't necessarily read theory to generate inspiration for my work, but I think it was from being at OCA in the 90s and taking seminar courses where the required readings were primary sources of theory, whereas now I think seminar syllabi now I think have a lot less theory, and certainly when I talk to younger artists, there doesn't seem to be an awareness of what theory offers. So I'd say I guess it's been significant but somewhat tangential to how I approach work. Perhaps philosophy or philosophically minded writers of fiction have been more significant directly on ideas that guide my work.
To what extent does literature play a role then?
I think it's a very significant role, and perhaps it was more significant when I first started out as being a real type of thematic guide. I mean, if I think of a writer like W.G. Sebald, and my interest in exploring notions of memory and distance, I think that was a pretty formative influence. Or if I think of even now a writer like Robert Walser and his short stories and just his particular sensibility in responding to everyday life is something that I can take a lot of joy in reading and a lot of inspiration from. So it's I think it's quite perennial that interest and what it can offer for me.
How does it offer? What does it offer? Is it through the images that come through the reading? Or?
I don't think it's the images. I think it's more so the sensibility of a way to be in the world and respond to the world. And so in that sense, it's not unlike certain artists or certain filmmakers. I don't think it's about the physical properties of the work per se, but it's a shared affinity for a type of attitude, a type of sensibility, a type of type of way to respond to life, or to what the world offers.
I know that Fry had quite considerable structuralist notion about how literature ethos come together. I'm kind of curious about the strategy. So he had notions about certain elemental affective constructs dominate a particular era. And I wonder, I don't want to necessarily go back to the zeitgeist, but that might be necessary.
Mm.
In your own case, Nick, do you find that there's a sensation, a sensibility that runs through the work, be it a sense of humor, a sense of ironic nuance, a sense of tragedy, remorse? Oh, I guess we could also call it confliction.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have a sense of an idea of the sensibility that you would articulate around the work?
I think ambivalence might be a guiding sensibility or sensation, perhaps a type of res. I think there is an ironic nuance there, but it's not a means towards humor as an end. I think that one can't help but adopt some type of ironic nuance by being an artist, and especially being a painter now, that there are degrees of irony for me that I think are quite effective, that aren't designed to generate guffaws, because that's never been my intention. Perhaps there's a melancholy, perhaps there's a certain acknowledgement of a type of loss, of a type of gap, a type of experience that's been on the cusp of disappearing, that the work is trying to articulate in some manner. So I'm not, I certainly think there is a degree of emotion, or there's a degree of affect to the work, and I do want there to be an affect, but it's not necessarily the primary aim. And I encourage a range of responses where viewers are going to perhaps draw or tease out their own sense of what that affect is.
A quick question, perhaps, about the public. Do you have a sense of how you would like or how you imagine the work being absorbed by the public?
Well, I think the hope is that the work might encourage them to look at the world in a new way, and that might be quite grandiose and quite too large an aim, but I think that art, at its most effective, if art has a function, it's to perhaps intensify one's attention, one's awareness with their everyday world. And so, in a way, it's not about the engagement with the work, but it's the work as a catalyst or as a prompt for them to maybe think about and to engage with other forms of phenomena that are, that aren't necessarily that could easily go unnoticed. Whether it's visual or something more more cognitive in nature.
Let's turn to teaching.
Okay.
What do you enjoy about teaching?
I enjoy working with the range of students I work with. So really that comes down to encountering sensibilities so different from my own. Again, ways of articulating the self vis-a-vis the world. Ways of, in the case of painting, ways of dealing with material, with process, the range of touch, the embodiment of the self through physical materials, and how that can take so many different forms. And so for me, the exciting thing is this nascent development of a voice, of a sensibility, and finding ways to help them develop that voice further into being a practicing artist. So offering what I can, but also just witnessing that growth, that degree of development. Is it's a wonderful thing to engage with and to observe, and of course the degree of energy, the degree of enthusiasm, the sense of hope.
Does that sense of hope sustain yourself as an artist?
I think it helps. I think that it's one aspect perhaps of ways to generate inspiration and enthusiasm.
Maintaining a career can be difficult. Have you found yourself surprised by that as time has gone on? Did you expect it when you started? How have you persevered, let's say?
Mm.
Or did it take perseverance?
I think it did and does, and will continue to. I think I was quite fortunate to be able to show my work upon graduating, to start working with Catherine Mulheron. In a way, I think it shifted for me in recent years, becoming what's referred to as a mid-career artist, and how the stakes change with age, and I think by being around, by showing work, in some ways it gets more difficult to sustain a presence, and I guess the longer one is doing it, the more ways that life can intrude in various forms. But I think that being in Toronto and having the opportunities I've had, not just with showing the work, but being able to teach now, has kept the practice quite focused and foregrounded. Where if I perhaps went into another profession to pay the bills, I don't know if I'd have the time and the means to still make work in the capacity that I've been making it. But it's being in Toronto at the same time. It's a huge challenge when I think of studio space, when I think of living space, the costs, the rising costs of the gentrification. So I don't know, what the future holds, but I've been lucky so far.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Your partner is is an art historian.
Correct.
And teaching in that capacity. Do you find that the relationship between an art practice and an art history within your own family group, do you find that's a productive, perhaps sustaining experience?
I do. I think it's been very productive, and my partner's concerns are, or rather, her interests in the type of painting she's writing about. I think can apply to a various degree to what I do, and she had been a practicing artist in the past, and so there's a great degree of empathy for empathy and awareness of the physicality of physical work, of painting, and so I think that she has always had really great advice and insight into what I'm doing. That and she can often bring in great historical forms of information and knowledge that can help me with aspects of the work. So I think it's a great alignment of our respective concerns.
Curators, Nick.
Curators. My encounters with curators have all been very pleasant and very productive. Perhaps compared to some other artists of my age, I haven't worked with that many curators. And certainly the curators I've worked with seem to operate perhaps differently than accounts I've read about or heard about, or even the broader phenomenon of the curator within the 21st century as according to some people, supplanting the role of the artist as essentially completing the work, or as generating the primary visual artistic experience. And when I read accounts of certain European or American curators, there is a degree of skepticism towards what that means or what the consequences are. And I think it goes hand in hand with a type of spectacle often that's being generated for, and often in museums simply to bring in high attendance, right? To offer an instantly gratifying experience that will bring in a lot of people. And so I don't know. I guess I don't have a blanket view of curators, but certainly curators at the level of Toronto, or even Canadian museums, Canadian institutions, have been great to work with and have seemed to really want to showcase the work, or responding to the work itself and finding new contexts to create productive conversations for and about the work.
Do you find the same experience with the critical responses that you've had yourself or that you've read others have had?
Yeah, by and large, although I think that while the curator seems to rise in stature or even in number, at least in Toronto, the critic seems to be vanishing. Certainly, the critic for popular print press. So that's something that I really think is unfortunate. This the lack of coverage within the dailies or even in the weeklies at this point, and not always finding what critics or art writers are writing for art periodicals. Not always finding it that engaging, because often it seems to be more a reflection of certain trends within a given season, or responding to certain artists that have already received a degree of attention. So I wish there were more critics writing in a greater variety of forums, ultimately. And I try to read as much criticism as I can. And so for my own work, I've been happy with the coverage of my work, both, and some of it was negative, but I thought it was productive. The critical criticism that I received, and it just seems that in recent years there isn't as much coverage, not just for my own work, but work in general in this city, at least.
Do you write about art?
I do, or I should say I have. I'd like to write more, and it's the challenge for me is time, especially when I teach. And I guess in a way, teaching has, to a degree, taken the place of art writing insofar as it's a way to engage with other with other creators, other artists, other perspectives, other sensibilities. But having said that, there's a joy to writing, the degree of analysis, the degree of reflection that it offers, that is very different than teaching for me. So I should say I have written about art, and I will continue to in some capacity, but it's certainly not as consistent as I'd like it to be.
Turning to the art system, what are your views on the art system as it's operating currently?
So do you mean within Toronto, within Canada, within?
Okay, let me think. The art system is a broadly based international phenomenon.
Okay.
Often very political. Certainly, it's a system that we're caught within. So I'm kind of curious whether it's national or more specifically Toronto-based, or whether international. Do you have any thoughts about the art system as you've experienced it?
In terms of participating within it or experiencing it directly, it's been predominantly within Toronto, within Canada, and I find aspects of it challenging, in terms of perhaps the very fact that it is a system that requires certain operations to function. So whether that's the way that what's required to have a show or what's required to promote a show, or what's required to remain to maintain an active practice. Being in that system, I think the degree of perhaps for me the challenge is a notion of networking, or a notion of the social and the conflation of the social with the system, and navigating that effectively when I don't necessarily want to navigate it in that way, to try and separate the social from other parts of the system, I guess is one challenge, or one aspect that is hard for me.
How do you feel about networking?
I don't feel great about it. I probably don't do it as much as I could do it. And so for me, the practice is predominantly focused on the work made in the studio, and accepting what you know what I might be sacrificing by not networking, or placing myself as an active player within the network. I think that's a choice that every artist has to make. Is just what degree of activity one needs or wants within that. But certainly, in recent years, with the advent of various forms of social practice, I think that for some the network is the only aspect that might matter, or that might be of any significance. I think some might say that my attitude is anachronistic, or somewhat dated, but I think I've accepted that position. So that's one aspect of the system, and I guess the other aspect is the unavoidable factor of money, and as a benchmark, as a measuring, as a way to determine value for so many that are both witnessing the system, maybe from the sidelines, but also for so many active participants, and maybe it's just even naive to complain about that, because certainly not just within art, but because of art's strange value system, it seems more exacerbated than just outside of art, within our daily life. And so, when I see arts coverage in the newspaper, it's all about an auction result, or when I hear people even talking about shows up in Toronto, and how many works sold or didn't sell, that type of crude system of measurement seems to be a pervasive aspect of the art system, both here, at a micro level, and broadly throughout the world. So it's an ambivalent position or relationship I have. But having said all this, I'm still, of course, quite interested in watching all of it occur.
It brings up the idea of the collector. Do you have any thoughts about the current state of collecting, or how it impinges on your own practice?
Well, I've been fortunate to have some pieces that I've made purchased for collections, I'm always happy when they are. And I really appreciate collectors who collect out of a desire to engage with work. In some ways, I think a great collector completes the work in a new way, and certainly recontextualizing the work and buying work for the experience simply of the proximity to it. I think is a great thing, and so if anything, it's been quite positive. The collectors that I've met in Toronto, some who've provided career advice and help, and who've I've had really productive conversations with, and not just productive, but also stimulating conversations, just about the zeitgeist, about the state of art, and so I'm all for patronage in all its forms, and of course collecting is one, and but I think a vital one.
The question of originality is a constant. Yeah, in some respects, it goes back to the very definition of the artist as being an original voice, and yet there has been, in a sense, an erosion of trust in originality over the last several decades. Theory, of course, has contributed to that quite significantly, postmodern theory, perhaps. Through all of this, Nick, when faced with this question of the original or the authentically original, and whether one feels a sense of reality or a sense of the real that one can touch, I'm kind of curious how you would see this question of the authentic today in a culture in the 21st century that has so challenged the notion of originality and accepted lip syncing, say, as a valid method of performance. Any thoughts?
Well, perhaps the only, perhaps if any notion of authenticity still exists, it's in being able to highlight the various forms of inauthenticity that seem to permeate our life, our world, our culture now. It is funny because I mean, terms of originality and authenticity aren't ones that I think too much about compared to perhaps 20 or 30 years ago, where I think, say in the 80s, the sense that there was a great loss of authenticity and originality was something that was addressed in a lot of work, and it seems as though now maybe it's taken for granted that there is no core. Is it possible to be authentic versus inauthentic? I think that perhaps to be part of the art system, there is a degree of inauthenticity that is called for. I don't think it's possible to embody one over the other, and I think there, perhaps it's a duality that requires a perennial negotiation given the shifts within the world now.